Our reading today from the Gospel of Luke, as I said, is part of a larger section that we call the Sermon on the Plain. This sermon is a compendium of Jesus' teachings that form the heart of the message of Luke's Gospel. Pretty much everything Luke says from here on out in his Gospel can be tied back to the words of Jesus that we find in this section, the Sermon on the Plain. And what we find in our reading for today is a collection of commandments that, if we were to take them seriously, would make us quite uncomfortable. But before I get to those commandments, I want to jump to the end of our reading, because there is a parable. And this parable summarizes what life would be like if we were to follow Jesus' teaching. That parable goes like this. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. Now, that parable requires a little explaining. What it is describing is a simple and common transaction that would occur in the marketplace in Jesus' day. Let's say you need to purchase grain. You want to make bread for your family. So you go to the market where the going rate for grain is, let's say, $5 a basket. You approach a vendor and you give them $5. The vendor then takes their measuring basket off the shelf and fills it to the top with grain. And then they take that grain and they pour it into your apron. It's an apron that you wear to carry things around in because clearly you forgot the reusable bag back at home, which is what we always do. Anyway, they fill your apron with the grain and you go home. Now, normally that would mark the end of a very straightforward transaction. You pay, they measure, you take your grain home. But this vendor is different. This vendor, they fill the basket. But before pouring the grain into your apron, they press down on the grain. And then they shake the basket several times so that all the grain settles down as much as possible, leaving room for more grain. They fill the basket back up to the top, but not a level basket, a heaping basket load. And then they take that and pour that into your apron, and you go home happy because you've got more than your money's worth. The measure you give will be the measure you get back. In life, what we give is what we expect to get back. In life, we always make sure that the scales are balanced. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. You pay for a basket of grain, you receive a basket of grain. No more, no less. But in God's kingdom, the rules are different. In God's kingdom, God gives us more than we deserve. God gives us an abundance. The parable of the grain is a parable about transaction, an exchange of money for a basket of grain. And so much of our lives is based on transactions. We buy things. We pay for services. We do favors in exchange for favors returned. We give intimacy, expecting intimacy in return. Too often our friendships and relationships become transactional with specific goals or benefits in mind. How many of us have broken a relationship because we did not feel we were getting enough in return? Jesus' Sermon on the Plain addresses our transactional impulses and attempts to flip them on their head. Before we look closely at Jesus' teachings in this passage, it's important to note how the reading begins. It starts with Jesus saying, "But I say to you that listen." To you that listen. Right away, we learn that what Jesus is about to say are not blanket commands for the entire world. No, these are intended for the Christ followers, for those who have come to Jesus and who are willing to listen to him. Some scholars have even suggested that the translation is, but I say to you that are still listening. You know, the ones that haven't wandered off because they don't like what he's saying. If you're still with me here, this is what I say. And what we find here now are 8 statements that turn the tide on human behavior. These commands of Jesus contradict logic as we know it. They break our transactional contracts. What we read, Jesus says, love your enemies. Do good to those that hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. From anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do you see how these commands disrupt our transactional world? They call us to give more than we can expect to receive. What kind of world would it be if people acted in this manner? Because the logic of society tells us that there's a balance, that if we've got enemies, we should hate them. We should try to hurt them too at every chance because they're our enemies. And if someone curses us, curse them back. Don't bless them. And if someone strikes us, we should smack them back. Eye for an eye. Our honor is at stake. There's a balance. But in Jesus' world, which is a really impractical world if you ask me, we are told to love our enemies, do good things to those who aim to bring us harm, pray for those who hurt us, and if someone takes something from us that they need, we should give them more. We are to give to anyone who begs of us, and if someone takes our stuff, we shouldn't ask for it back. Let them keep it. These 8 commandments are then summarized when Jesus says, do to others as you would have them do to you. So what we find here is Jesus calling for a realignment of our hearts, a new way of relating to this world. In our lives today, we've got enemies. Enemies are a dime a dozen. We've got conservatives versus liberals, Democrats versus Republicans, MAGA versus anti-MAGA, pro-gun and anti-gun, pro-Israel and pro-Gaza, Canadian hockey versus American hockey. The list goes on. We should not be happy being so divided like this. It's as if Jesus could see into the future, and now he's calling us to heal our divisions. And then Jesus talks about sinners, whole nother subject here. Sinners, what are they? Sinners, well, are actually just regular, ordinary folk. All of us fall into this category of sinners. Sinners aren't necessarily bad. They're not evil. They're not incapable of loving. As Jesus says, anybody can love someone who loves them back. Anybody can lend to somebody if they expect repayment. Jesus explains that sinners reciprocate good deeds to those who are good to them. Sinners gladly lend money to those they expect will pay it back. Sinners follow the transactional rules of society. They live in this world and follow those rules. It's what we do. But Christ followers, on the other hand, are in a different category. Christ followers are called to lift themselves above that of the sinners. Christ followers are called to love everyone, even especially their enemies, not just those who are going to love back, everyone. Christ's followers are called to lend, but expect nothing in return. They're called to embrace a new and radical reality. And the reward for this lifestyle, it's not glory or riches or power. The reward is to join the ranks of the children of God. And these children of God are merciful. They do not judge. They are forgiving. They are generous. They live in the kingdom. And the kingdom is a place defined not by an abundance of goods, but by an abundance of life. I'd like to finish this morning with a story about selfless giving. It's a long story, so hang in there. If you are to leave this church and travel west on West Main, which is out front, and go 8 miles, on the side of the road, you will see a sign that identifies that section of Highway 70 as part of the Trail of Tears. Now, the Trail of Tears marks an especially dark period in our nation's history. During the time of the Trail of Tears, approximately 60,000 Native Americans were forcibly relocated from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States to the designated Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River. It's now the state of Oklahoma. These forced displacements were carried out by government authorities after the passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Those who were removed or relocated were members of the Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations. That journey from their home to the Indian Territory was difficult and deadly. Thousands died along the way of exposure, starvation, and disease. The first people to be moved were the Choctaw. And after they had been relocated, in 1847, just 16 years after their relocation, the Choctaw were still struggling to rebuild their lives in this strange new place. At one of their tribal meetings, a stranger showed up. And this man said that he represented the Memphis Irish Relief Committee. And the committee was collecting funds. He read the letter from the committee. They were soliciting donations to assist the people of Ireland. Why Ireland? Well, in 1847 was the second year of the Irish potato famine. In Ireland at the time, subsistence farmers relied on potatoes for their survival, and 2 years earlier, a fungus-like organism had entered into the ecology, destroying the potato crops. Eventually, 1 million residents of Ireland would die of starvation and related causes. The Choctaw knew too well about starvation and harsh conditions. They remembered being driven from their homes by U.S. soldiers and forcibly marched to Oklahoma. They lost thousands of their people on that journey. The Choctaw answered the plea for the Irish people, and anonymous individuals pledged a total of $170. That doesn't sound like much, but adjusting for inflation today, that would equal about $6,500, which would be a monumental amount of money for an impoverished community to donate to people they'd never met and would probably never see. In fact, that $170 was the largest gift received by the Irish. The Choctaws gave so that others might live. They gave expecting nothing in return. But the story doesn't end there. 5 years ago, during the COVID pandemic, Native Americans on reservations were hit especially hard by the disease. And to assist these people, a GoFundMe account was established for families in the Hopi and Navajo reservations in Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. And it wasn't long after the establishment of this fund that the people in charge of the account noticed something strange. They were receiving a large number of donations from Ireland. Although 170 years had gone by, the Irish had not forgotten. They remembered the generosity of the Native Americans in their time of need. And of the $6 million donated to that fund, over $1 million came from Ireland. Over 25,000 people gave anywhere from $10 to over $1,000. The measure you give will be the measure you get back. And so I want to return to that parable about buying grain in the marketplace, because I think we need to turn it around. The parable is not about us receiving an abundance, but it is really about our giving in abundance. In this parable, we should be the vendor, not the purchaser. We should work to ensure that all we meet are given a good measure of God's joy, no matter what it may cost us. We should love those who don't love us, give to those from whom we expect no return. We should shatter the rules of transactions. Because in a transactional-based world, what you do dictates what I do. What you do dictates what I do, and vice versa. When we return hate with hate, the original hate has won. And in the reign of God, what we do is not directed by what others do to us, which is why we want to be in the reign of God. In the reign of God, we live and act for others. In the reign of God, we don't live by these transactional relationships, but instead we live covenantal relationships. And for this reason, we should do to others as you would have them do to you. Amen.